Hi guys, welcome back to Small Scale Adventures, where we're getting started with our new project C44KM. Gonna begin the build with building up the axles. It's not what it says in the instructions, I know, but I like to go through the rest of the build and have the axles ready to go when I need to bolt them onto the chassis. So let's have a look at what we've got in the box. Okay, so here we go. We've got everything we're going to need for the builds: axle casings, knuckles and pumpkin covers. We've got our bevel gears and pinions, all the steering links and the UJs for the front axle, screws and fixings, ball races, and we've got our Loctite and our grease for the axles. So we're going to get started with the rear axle. So put my front axle bits over there and going to pop off the input cover first of all. Take out the screws, put them somewhere where you're not going to knock them on the floor. I'm going to be needing my drive shaft cups as well. Fortunately, they are just out of reach in the gearbox bag. Pop the input cover off, and I'm going to be building my pinion and drive shaft cup up first. Grab the pinion out of my bag of brass parts, and I'm also going to need 2 small ball races. Pop them out of the bag as well. Good idea if you've got it, a little shallow plastic tray, something that you can empty these bits out into and pick them up easily. So we need ball race into the input cover and ball race into the outside of the input cover. Might need pressing in. There it goes, that's gone home. No, it hasn't. A little bit more of a press. Oh, I've never had one that reluctant before. Straighten it out and in it goes. Pop. And then we pop the pinion in. Might need a little bit of wet dry paper just to take the burrs from the machining on that. Just give that a run round. Take any burrs from the machining off and it will run through the bearings easily. In it goes. That spins nicely, no rubbing in there. And now we need a cup from the drive shaft. Makes the drive shafts a little more difficult to assemble in situ later on, but will reap benefits with the longevity of your axle make. So what we're going to do is hold the pinion and the axle cup together with slight pressure so that we take out any possible lateral movement, and that will help the pinion run true and help the gear mesh stay good in the axle. Going to pop that together like that and do up the grub screw. Of course, we're going to need a little blob of Loctite on there. So we'll work a grub screw out of our bag. Going to pop that on the end of the Allen driver. Really like these tools, good value. Wera 1.5mm hex driver. Pop some Loctite on there. I'm sure people will be going, oh my god, what is he doing? Why is he using his Loctite like that? I don't know, this just seems to work for me. I don't tend to have axles that fall to pieces. Line up the flat, slight pressure, and we'll pop that grub screw in. Check it for lateral movement. There's a little, might try and get that a little bit tighter, but what I don't want is any resistance spinning it, and that's gone a little far the other way now. I'm just going to slacken that off again. Oh dear. It's all in the feel, and if it doesn't feel right, just reassemble. And give it another go. You've got plenty of time to tinker with that while the Loctite goes off. Now, you've used Loctite, so it doesn't have to be He-Man tight. Just give them a tweak and that's it. You're not trying to strip the grub screw before you even get a chance to run it. There's slight resistance in that, but it's also taken out the lateral movement, so I'm happy with that. And I'm going to carry on with building the rest of the axle. That can go over to one side. Pop the simulation brake drums off. They hold the axle together at the ends. Nice touch from the WPL design that isn't present on the aftermarket axles. There's our axle casing. Let's pop him open like that. There we go. Now we're going to need our rear axle shafts. That's the long one from the bag. We're going to need our bevel or our spool gear. And we're going to need the rear axle hexes. And 3 more grub screws from our bag. There, our roof bag is going to make us a handy little tray for getting to these bits and pieces a bit easier. Grub screw 1, grub screw 2, and grub screw 3. You'll see folk recommend buying aftermarket grub screws. I think That's possibly because they're doing them up too hard in the first place. I've never had any issue with the WPL supplied grub screws. Use the Loctite, use heat to undo them, and use a good quality tool. So let's get on with getting the axle together. We need our 1, 2, 3, 4 small ball races. And we are good to go. And the spool gear has run on to the axle nicely. I'm just going to give that a quick dust over where it's been machined to make sure the bearings slide on nicely too. I can never remember which way round fats go on the axle shaft. It's definitely not that way. So there we are that way round. Spool's going on that way. And I'm just going to pop a grub screw in. Not the permanent fixing, of course, but it's just going to help me with the assembly, and I'm only going to just do that up. Ping, there it goes. Try that again. Looking for my axle flats. Pop that on there, and that's just got the slightest resistance on there. 2 ball races. And I'll get everything in position. There we go. So what we're looking for is the axle shaft being totally centered within the axle casing. It looks to me like this flat is a little closer to the bearing this side than the other, so we know that the shaft is going to need to come through that spool gear quite a bit. And now that's looking pretty good to me. The axle shaft is centered in the casing, and the spool gear is where it needs to be. There is a little bit of left and right play. I don't currently have any of my little shim gears left, so we're going to have to take out that left and right play using the axle hexes, which I've done on several builds. Doesn't seem to be a problem. Again, pop in all the grub screws in dry to begin with. Till I'm happy with everything's position, and then I'll take them out one at a time and put the Loctite in them. Nice and free, and we've got a little of that fore and aft movement, so we know we're going to need to close those axle hexes up a touch. So we've lost our free movement, done those up a little bit too tight. Let's take that back, and we've got our free movement back. I'm happy with that. Axle hexes are even. We've eliminated as much left and right movement as we possibly can. So we are good to give this axle its permanent build. Out comes the grub screw. On goes the Loctite. Give that its tweak. Let's go to this end. Checking as I go along that I've still got my free movement, but I haven't got my left and right play. And the last one. Looking good. Pop the top half of the casing on. And we have lost a little bit of free movement. Doesn't look like the spool gear rubbing on the casing. Try that slight adjustment with the other half of the casing. That's rolling nicely that side now. Tweak it all back up. And that's what we're after. That rotates nicely. Have a look and see what our pinion mesh is going to be like. So we are going to need some spacing in there to keep that moving smoothly, but we have got our plastic, we've got our paper spacers, so we just need to make sure we space that input cover away from the axle casing to suit the gear mesh between the spool gear and the pinion. before we do that, we're going to need to take the paint off the lugs on the pumpkin cover. Makes them assemble much more easily. Goes in nicely. Pop our bolts through. Machine screws through, not bolts, of course, are they? Gonna start out with, what have we got there? 1, 2, 3. Let's go with 3 to begin with, and we'll pop in another one if need be. Position, and let's get the input cover on as well. doing the screws up progressively and not just working round in a circle. Got nice movement there still. They do get a little bit tight to turn as the screw heads are slightly larger than the clearance on the pumpkin cover. But I suppose that just means they don't come undone very easily. Not going to tweak these down super tight. We've still got nice smooth movement, and we've got movement back through the axle as well, which is what you want to see when you build. You'll have noticed I made the deliberate mistake of not putting any grease in the axle, so now I'm going to have to dismantle it again and pop some grease in there. But at least I know it's going to go together nicely when we put it back together. Let's get that lubed up nicely. There we go, plenty of grease in there now. Pop that input cover back on. Has gone a bit tight, so I'm just going to back each of those off half a turn, and that's lovely again, running both ways through the axle and from the pinion. Little slight notchiness to that, but that will soon pass as the axle gets some use. Lovely. Pop our simulation brake drums back on, and that is the rear axle done. Pop him aside and we will have a look at the front axle. So here we are, ready to put the front axle together. I have already assembled the input cover in the same way that I did for the rear axle, with the bearing cup, taking out as much left to right play as possible. A couple of other things I've done before I get started. I've stripped the paint off the cover, the pumpkin cover pegs. I've taken the paint off the top of the knuckles. This loosens up the steering a little sometimes. And I've done the same on the inside of the axle. Just gets rid of any burrs from the machining and takes the thickness of the paint off there as well. And we're ready to go. So the axle, just going to whip that round with the abrasive just to make sure the bearings can slide on easily. Make sure we get the gear the right way round. That's how that goes, isn't it? And then we want our spool gear on there. And a grub screw. Now with the front axle, I find completely assembling the front axle without any of the covers dry, first of all, is the best way forward. And then going through and putting each of the grub screws back in with the Loctite is the best thing to do. You can find that if the knuckle universal joints aren't quite positioned correctly, they can bind up when the steering operates, and you don't want that because your truck isn't going anywhere. I've put this in the wrong way round, that's why it looks odd. Try that again. It's still in. I've put the whole thing together the wrong way round. Another good reason for dry assembly: if you do make balls up, you can change it. That grub screw didn't quite escape onto the floor. That's better. Getting a tiny amount of contact with the axle casing on there. Same on the other side. So I'm going to grab my abrasive and just give that a slight see where we are with that. Yeah, that's clearing nicely now. Everything we want is good there. Now we need the universal joints and their grub screws. First grub screw in. Not tight, but just holding on flat. Likewise at the other end. Everything's smooth for now and very little side to side movement in that crown gear, which is what we like to see. Ball races into the knuckle. Again, they sometimes need a bit of a press in. Click, you hear it go home. Our little brass top hat bushes and our short machine screws. Top hat goes in. Again, we shall Loctite these once assembly is complete. That's all looking good. A little bit of encouragement to get the drive hex to run into the bearing then, but it's all good. And it looks like everything is positioned nicely on that front axle. Very little resistance. And very little left to right movement, if any left to right movement in that spool gear. So we can run through now and Loctite everything. And it's a little easier now on the front axle because those screws on the knuckles are holding everything in position. Look at the grub screw position on the UJs and you can pick up where the flat is on the axle itself. Give it a tweak. make sure everything is free to turn again. I've tightened something up while I've been doing that, so I'm just going to adjust these UJs again. There we go, that's much better. Good, good, right. Now to get the pinion mesh sorted in just the same way as we did with the rear axle. We're going to need some spacing again to keep that running smoothly. We'll go with our 3 again, and we'll see how it pans out. Should have prepared these off camera, I suppose, but we're at it now. Little tear in that one, but it doesn't really matter. Doing. Just going to back some of these tighter ones off slightly, and that is looking good. We have got run through from the pinion and from the axle stubs, so we know that axle is running nicely. Give it a slight tweak this side. And we're still good. And obviously as that axle wears in, as with the rear axle, we can tighten those cover screws up a little more to make sure we maintain our mesh as the gears wear. Last thing we need to do is a dab of Loctite in the knuckle threads. Put that in the right way round, eh? There we go. There are our axles built up and ready to go. Hope you've enjoyed the video, guys. Really long one this time. Let's keep them a bit shorter and snappier next time. Thanks for watching the axle build, guys. If you've got any comments or questions, please post below. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed the content. Good night. See you again in the next stage of the build where we start working on the chassis.